Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Blockchain Untangled. My name is Kess Knight, and I am with ACRO, and I would love to introduce Dr. Helen Garrett, the University Registrar and Chief Officer of Enrollment Information Services at the University of Washington. And I will pass it over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Cass. So glad to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are listening to. So glad to be here today. So fun to see so many names I recognize on the list, so thanks, my peeps, for being here. Just wanted to let you know that I will also be presenting this session at the ACRO Technology and Transfer Conference in Minneapolis in July. I certainly hope that you're planning to attend. If you are attending and you know others that are coming that might benefit, I hope that you'll have them sign up for the conference and come check out the same session again this July in Minnesota. So before we begin, just a gentle disclaimer. I am an expert on two things. I am quite the expert on being Helen Garrett, University Registrar and Chief Officer of Enrollment Information Service at University of Washington. And I'm an expert on my journey that I'm going to share over the last 2 years over 9 different states to kind of demystify blockchain, but I'm definitely not a blockchain expert. And there is so much talk about blockchain now. Even as recently as yesterday, I received a notice that there's a big blockchain conference coming up in Seattle in August. It's one that travels all over. I saw a quote yesterday on LinkedIn that there are 4,500 job openings listed in Link right now that have Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, or blockchain in the title or the description, and that's a 151% increase over 2017. So this whole fascination with blockchain is pretty widespread and something that people are interested. So I'm really glad that you chose to hang out with us for this next hour. So I want to start with a story that has really impacted my journey to learn blockchain. So this is me on Thanksgiving Day, 1983. I'm 19. I'm sure you're loving the monogram sweater and the check skirt there, plaid skirt. But on that day, my dad told me at Thanksgiving dinner that I couldn't get married until I had earned my PhD. Well, at the time, I was head over heels with my childhood sweetheart, and I ended up marrying him 4 years later, saw his PhD, so I showed my dad. But what happened is then over the years, so many mentors encouraged me to get my PhD. They said, Helen, you've got to do it. You've got to keep moving up. And so what kept me from doing that until I finally earned it in 2016? And it's one word, statistics. So having taken statistics twice as a business undergraduate at Michigan State University, the second time was a bonus because I failed it the first time. And then 2 more times in my master's program where I barely survived, I thought there is no way I could ever get a PhD or a doctorate if I was going to have to take statistics and then be able to apply it to my research as a doctoral student. So it was really that fear of technology, math, that kept me back. Well, I'll tell you what, I did begin my doctoral program at age 50 in 2013, 30 years from almost the date that my dad gave me that proclamation. And I did have to take statistics. And thanks to 10 hours every Saturday of using this textbook, which I highly recommend for anybody trying to learn statistics, it's amazing, Khan Academy, and hours and hours and hours of YouTube videos, I not only passed my research statistics class, but I ended up with a 97% in the class. So what changed? What changed is I overcame my fear, and I really stopped doubting that I couldn't do this, that it was hard, that I couldn't understand it. But I jumped in, I used tools to help me understand it, and I really conquered the unknown. And I learned research methods, and I'm really proud of the fact that I'm Dr. Garrett now, and my dad is really pleased. So let's talk about what we want to accomplish today with you. So really 3 intentions. I want you to experience the same victory with understanding blockchain that I have accomplished now. I want to give you an introduction so you can kind of hold your own when the concept and the term comes up, share my journey over the past 2 years to understand it, and then really exploring why this matters. Now, I came into this journey with a pretty, what I would call, funky tech background. In my previous experience at Lane Community College working with the Illusion Banner tools, oversaw 25 different software implementations, and I continue to be a liaison in my Chief Officer Enrollment Information Services position with UWIT. But I've got to tell you, even with that comfort level with technology, coming to understand blockchain didn't necessarily come easy. If this session were a dissertation, and thank goodness it isn't, my theoretical framework to support my thoughts today would be this, and I say this all the time and people hear me say this. Any technological transformation is 2% technology and 98% cultural transformation shift. Learning blockchain and understanding why it matters and to imagine the ability to transform the registrar and our credentialing work, that's a cultural shift, far more than a technological transformation. So as we go through my journey, you'll see that with each stop along the way, I'll talk about what was going along with technological transformation, but more importantly, what were the emotional or cultural shifts that I was going through. So my journey began in July of 2016 at my first Acro Technology and Transfer Conference, and really continues now all the way through, and we'll walk through this time as I'm diving deeply into the comprehensive learner record, and we'll talk more about that. And so as we go through the deck, like I said, I'm going to take you across these 9 states in these 2 years to get a sense of what I have learned along the way. So in the first conference that I attended there, I had left my position over enrollment services after 16 years at Lane Community College in February 2016 in the position I'm in now. And this conference in Anaheim was my very first Acrotech, and it was certainly my first exposure to blockchain. The session that I went to was called Beyond the Blockchain, Adding Trust to Digital Credentials. So it was my very first time I even heard the word blockchain. And you'll see I've got a picture there of the old iPods. And it reminded me of when I was on the sidelines at my daughter's soccer practice in 2004 when she was in 4th grade. And another mom came up, Tammy, and she had this really cool blue thing on her, whatever she's holding it. I'm like, what is that? And she said, it's an iPod. And I had her explain it, and I'm like, it has your music. And so I remember in that moment thinking, this is a really important thing I'm going to value. I have no idea what kind of voodoo magic this is, but it's going to matter to me. So as I attended that session at Acrotech back then in 2016, and I'm listening to this thing called blockchain, I knew that this was going to be something important that I was going to want to pay attention to. Ironically enough, you'll note the title was Beyond the Blockchain, Adding Trust. So there was no explanation of blockchain. So it was just, they were talking about it, and they were using terms like disintermediation. I'm like, what the heck is that? What is this strange word? They referred back to what was then called the Comprehensive Student Record Project, and really introduced me to this idea of a compository of electronic records that goes well beyond a student's grades and GPA and degree earned, but could bring in what they've done in research and working and student experience all into one document. And they talked about how blockchain could verify these credentials. So that was my technological enlightenment, like, ooh, what is this thing? But culturally, there was a lot more going on for me. So many of you know Tom Black, who at the time was at Stanford University as University Registrar, and he's at Johns Hopkins now. And you'll see his name a lot throughout this presentation. He had a big part of me learning what was going on. I was kind of starstruck by Tom. I thought he was like, ooh, you know, the best registrar out there, and looking up to him. So here he was explaining this thing so easily and without any nervousness, and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. So I automatically had a sense of intimidation. I do want to say that I looked around and I noticed that those presenting were all men, and there didn't seem to even be a lot of women in the audience. And I'm like, that's kind of weird. And that won't be the first time that I make note of that, but I do remember thinking that. But I really thought as I left that session, like, slow down, what in the world are you guys talking about? So I had the gumption to boldly go up to Tom afterwards, and didn't even know he knew me, but he did. And I said, I really appreciate this, but I need you to slow down and not dumb down what you're saying, but to realize that people attending are in 2016 not where you are in this understanding of blockchain, and could you weave in some information and just know that we're not in the same place. And he was so incredibly gracious, and not only immediately took that into consideration for his other sessions during that conference, but I've seen him do it since. But it was a really important moment for me to have that connection. So time passed, and I was settling into my job at University of Washington and getting to know Seattle, and off I went in February to our annual American Association of University Registrar gatherings, the 64 Research One registrars, university registrars, brilliant, supportive, wise, informed colleagues that gather to talk about things that matter to us as R1 University registrars. And again, there was Tom, of course, and he said these two things that really caught my attention. A transcript is a record of everything a student has forgotten. I thought, wow, that is so true. We depend on that so much, but it's so true. And then he also said, so just find some information science students to set this up for you, meaning using blockchain to be able to validate certificates or credentials. I'm like, well, okay, that seems pretty easy. It worked for him at Stanford. Could that work at UW? But again, what was going on for me more in that emotional cultural transformation moment? So I could grasp now that we were going to use this thing, I still didn't really understand, called blockchain to validate certificates and eventually transcripts. But what is blockchain? I felt like I was still wandering around asking that question, what is blockchain? And exactly what would I be telling these information science students to do? But I'll have to admit, I'm a pretty out there person, pretty bold, but I was still embarrassed to ask, like, what would happen? So, and I remember thinking that moment, like, why is this so easy for my peers to understand? Again, which was mostly men I was watching talking about it. Like, and then as I started to think, did I miss a class somewhere, like those terrible recurring nightmares where you forgot to take a biology exam? Like, how did I miss this? So what happened at that meeting was transformational because in the evening or sometime when people were gathering, I saw who I call the kings, these 5 gentlemen who I adore, who are really leaders as registrars in this space, hanging out and talking, and they were talking about blockchain. And I literally jumped myself into the conversation and said, I want in. I want to know what this means. This seems really important. And they literally adopted me in. And from that moment, my journey just jumped into hyper gear in terms of my exposure and my opportunity to find out more about what was going on. The next thing that happened is the very next month, I was approached by our Associate Dean of our graduate school, who is president of the Western Association of Graduate Schools. We had invited Matt Patinsky from Parchment to come and really just help us to understand what are the possibilities of this kind of comprehensive learner record, or a way for a student to not just have grades and coursework, but all their other activities in one area. He'd come to our campus and exposed us to this idea. And I had coordinated that meeting with her. So she said, Helen, hey, I am the president of this meeting that's happening in Seattle, and we really want to talk about this new frontier with credentialing. What is this cultural shift that the registrars are facing, and blockchain? And would you mind coming and doing a presentation? I was like, okay. So I did. So in this moment, I was actually the expert on what I was talking about. So I went through and I reviewed, which I'll show you in the next slide, these aggregated credentials concept for graduate education professionals, like this idea of what if we thought well beyond just the Carnegie units in the transcript and allowed a way for your graduate students to tell their story far beyond just what we think of what we're doing. And I explained the credentials. Culturally, transformation-wise, I actually barely knew what I was talking about. Again, oddly enough, Matt was invited to present with me. So here was this gentleman, the CEO of Parchment, that knew everything about this, standing next to me, and I'm in my babyhood trying to explain about credentials and blockchain. But I did know something about launching that registrar transformation of thinking. And I did have all of you in mind that are registrars far and smaller schools and not necessarily the big schools that are making this happen. And I thought about, you know what, if we're going to embrace using blockchain to validate and use this comprehensive learner record, there's going to need to be a shift in the way that we are thinking. So I stood at the microphone and said to this large audience, I really think it's time to move the ownership of student records from the institution to students. And you could have heard a pin drop because I think they were stunned that they'd never heard a registrar speak like this. And this represented, for me, kind of a super cultural tectonic level shift of even in myself, like, wow, I never really thought about it. I mean, the record does belong to the student. And what you'll hear me talk about is the beauty of blockchain and this other way of validating could actually make it so that the learner, the graduate, the person looking for a job could have access to their records all the way throughout their employment experience and in belonging to them. So that was historic for me, that I was actually starting to realize we could make a shift here. So this is a chart that I had created, just thinking about all the different things that could be validated by blockchain that would be a part of the comprehensive learner record. So I presented this chart of elements and items that blockchain can validate. I sounded really knowledgeable, but I really wasn't. But they didn't seem to notice. They appreciated me being there. Well, my next travel took me back again to Acro Technology and Transfer Conference. This was last summer. I was off to New Orleans in July. Woohoo, thunderstorms, heat, beignets, and beads. But it was a great conference. And you can bet that from that point forward, if there was going to be a session on anything to do with blockchain, I was going to be there. So I had the privilege of going to a session that had Joyce Li from Stanford University, and she was explaining blockchain concepts. She is brilliant. She is a researcher. She's a scientist. But she was able to explain it to me in a way that I actually understood. And I remember like, oh, the light bulb going on, like I think I'm actually starting to understand this concept. She talked about hash and Merkle tree, and they were these new kind of tinkling words of like, what are these things? And she would give a definition of them to start to get us exposed to terminology that comes along as you are learning blockchain. And for the first time ever, really, now think how late this is in my journey, it's a year later, I've gotten an explanation of what blockchain is and why would we use it. So as far as my cultural transformation, I was finally starting to get it. I was feeling a little bit more solid on that. And I pictured this hash, which I'll talk about in a minute, and this Merkle tree math, as really just as I have the picture there, that the hash was a key that either it matched what was encoded in the block in the chain and it opened it up and said, yes, this is a valid record, or it didn't. And it gave it, I started to understand that if that code didn't match, then something had been altered and it would be rejected. And so I was getting the basic concept of blockchain in that moment. It was really the first time that I realized that I don't have to understand the science to embrace why blockchain is useful. I am a person who is very experiential. I like to get my hands into things and play with it. But I suddenly realized, you know what, Helen Grace, you don't have to really understand the science behind this. You just have to know why you want to use it and what would it do to serve our students, our colleagues. So blockchain is an example of disruptive innovation. I'm sure you've heard that concept. I know in my doctoral dissertation I quoted Dr. Clayton Christensen, who is a Harvard business professor, this idea of products that come on the market that are cheaper, smaller, more convenient to use. And I realized that blockchain was in itself a disruptive technology. It could make transcript and credential validation easier, faster, and simple. And if we think about it, these are all disruptive innovations that I'm popping up here on the screen. We learned about them, we tested them out, we accepted them, and we came to trust them. And I want to lend to you today that blockchain is no different, that you don't have to know the science behind it, but you do need to embrace it and to trust it. And it is a disruptive innovation, and we're still very much at that point. So off I went to my next opportunity, which was the Lumina Foundation convening in Indiana, woohoo, new state. And this is where my world and understanding of blockchain was going to be completely rocked for the positive, but differently. So Lumina, as you probably know, is a private foundation. They're fantastic. They're a super friend of higher education. They're really interested in the completion agenda and how do we, there are 45,000 jobs going unfilled right now in industry and businesses because there's a disconnect between learners or talent being able to share what they've done to match what employers are looking for. So Lumina is funding some, you'll hear about later, an ACRO grant that we're working on it, but they're really stepping in with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other big credentialing entities to find a way to close that gap between people not having a good way to explain what they've done to match up with jobs. So this was a gathering of folks to come and talk about that. So in terms of technological enlightenment, blockchain was finally explained in a visual manner, which I'm going to talk about. So, and I'm a very visual learner, and we all need to know what kind of learner we are in this moment in learning blockchain. But seeing a visual picture of what it looked like really helped me a lot in that process. Again, talked a lot about comprehensive, what used to be comprehensive student records project was now turned to comprehensive learner. And there's a difference because it's not just focusing on that moment of leaving an institution of higher education, but at the whole life chain of someone demonstrating what they've learned, whether it's been in college, university, apprenticeship, or on the job. But talking about how blockchain would be a part of that. And then my favorite quote that I got from Matt Gee, who I'll talk about in a minute, was, blockchain is not magic, it's math. And remember, again, here I am afraid to say statistics, afraid to go down there because I can't learn math. It's not magic, it's just math. But with this process, you can trust the math and you don't have to understand how to do it. Well, I'll tell you, when I walked into the room, and this seems to be a theme with me, that I get invited to these meetings now and actually have no idea what's going on, why I'm there. So I walked in, and I'm looking around, and there are chief information officers or people from the clearinghouse, research, technical experts on this whole space about blockchain and credentialing. I'm like, what in the world am I doing here? I found out later, and I'm glad that I went. But Matt Gee, who works, has a think tank with the University of Chicago, as well as an organization that really is looking at this credentialing matching situation that we have and trying to close that gap. He just gave us fabulous presentations on blockchain. And I really resonated, and I remember this is the cultural transformation part of this. I resonated to him saying, trust is the key to all of this. And what he was saying is, even going back to when they were original, before there were banks, and how people kept stones and they kept it hidden in something and they had to trust that somebody wasn't going to steal the stone and that kind of thing. But he painted this whole history of keeping track of records and documents. And the one element through all of that it could not be trustworthy are humans. And what he was saying is, in this moment where we're using math or computers to validate, a computer doesn't value or have emotion. If it's going through and using blockchain to validate and authenticate using the hash and the Merkle tree, blah, 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 either the data has not been tampered with and it's valid, or it's not. And that was really huge for me to realize that we might think, well, gosh, why would we trust computers? But I actually think I trust computers a lot more than humans who might be dishonest or make mistakes in terms of counting things. Well, over the course of the 2 days, I found myself, especially in the second day, literally needing to stand up, and my heart is racing. And I was like, this is a disruptive innovation, and we cannot, we being higher education, let it take off without us or let it be vendor-led. Definitely want to count on our credentialing vendors and our partners. We love them. We need them to help us through this. But I really started to get this sense of equity and access. And what I mean by that is, what about those schools that don't have deep pockets? What about those schools that have 1.5 IT people to take care of every need in the entire college or university? Will everyone have access to this? If students are using these keys to get in and validate their credentials, will everyone have access to that? And so there became this kind of tour or moment I wanted to be to reach out to all of you to say, you know, we need to be watching what's happening, but this can't be a technology or something that's just for the few. I need it to be for the many. And so after this conference, I was like, I am all into this now, and also wanting to socialize and reach out to my colleagues like all of you who might not have as deep knowledge in this. So math's explanation was just like my doctoral statistics class. I was finally understanding what the technology was and why I even cared. And he talked about these 3 big ideas associated with using blockchain to validate credentials. So this idea of a digital signature, and the way I would interpret that is math opens up each block and it validates whether the contents in that block have been altered or not. And it can be a public or private key validation. Second is this idea of safeguard. So using that clever math, no single point of updating can happen because it's distributed and lots of people are out on the blockchain. There's no one entity that can go in and just change what's there because it's all connected to these other blocks. So it lessens the likelihood that something's going to be compromised. And that's kind of that third point, to preserve. Everyone on the blockchain has an identical copy of the blockchain. So if you think about what those of you on the call with me that are registrars do for a living, if you're validating a transcript and someone went in somehow and changed a grade, or someone, heaven forbid, happens to us like 3 times a week, comes up with a fake diploma, you can't go in and change that because that record has already been distributed all over to the rest of the blockchain. So if someone tried to alter that, when someone came in to validate it, because that knowledge of what was previously the record that had been altered was stored in the blocks below, there wasn't going to be any, it wouldn't allow for the validation. So my translation of these 3 big ideas is that blockchain can be public or private. Clever math validates all records below in the chain to ensure there's not been amended, and then no one can infiltrate data in each of the blocks. And he talked about how really powerful computers are just guessing and guessing and guessing on that hash code until it opens up the block. So it's not something that can be just done by like someone's home computer to go in and figure out the right key to open up a block to validate information. It's very powerful computers crunching through and guessing until ding, they get the right validation. And that code says, yep, what you are trying to validate. So if you've received a transcript and you are another institution or an employer and you use that key to go in and say, was this accurate? If it matches the hash codes you're in, yep, it's a good document. If it's been altered and it doesn't, it's going to reject it. He told a story, and often when I'm in elevators and telling people about blockchain, and my family who are probably tired of hearing about it, I talk about how he explained just the whole process of right now if you're trying to buy a house, it takes like 60 to 90 days to make it happen because the title company has to go back through all of the records associated with the owner, the creation, the building of that house, the licensing, changes have happened to it. And a human has to go through all the way starting when the house was first built and sold, and then all the way to the point that you're ready to take ownership. And they have to validate each process along the way to make sure that the chain, nothing has been altered. So he talked about that if you're going through and you buy a house and then you put on an addition and then maybe there was a leaky roof and that's been recorded and then you had it fixed and then other things happen. Humans are going through and checking that. But in using blockchain, if someone wanted to be fraudulent, they could take out that there had been a leaky roof in the physical documents, and no one might not know that that was there. But using blockchain, because that knowledge that there had been a leaky roof and it had been fixed is encoded in the information, in that Merkle tree in the document, when you try to go in and validate that, you're going to see that. So you can't hide things. You can't have information get changed because it's already been distributed out. I don't know if that helps you, but for me, it helped me just to understand why this idea of using math and technology to validate seemed to make a lot more sense than depending on humans. So I learned some major lessons from the Lumina convening, and I want to share these with you. One of my favorite quotes of many from Matt is he says, "This is not a technology problem, it's a people accepting blockchain problem." And remember my slide when I talked about the 98% cultural shift and 2% technology. So it's not that we don't know how to do this. We are producing hundreds and hundreds of information data scientists. They're pouring out of our institutions that are being trained on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain. So it's not a technological challenge. It's how do we get all of us to join in. So as I have gone through this journey and had conversations with some of you about learning blockchain, here are some of the things that I have heard that can invoke fear. So fear of appearing ignorant. I have openly disclosed to you that I have felt that way. I felt really not in the know, that somehow I missed, like I said, the lecture on blockchain. And no one wants to feel like you don't know what you're talking about. As much as we're trying to do to do our regular jobs as university and college registrars, with these new technologies, you're like, oh, it's one more thing I'm supposed to learn. So sometimes it's just easier to kind of ignore it than to jump into it. But jumping into it can come against not knowing what's going on. I have had some pretty intense conversations with some of my registrar peeps about this idea of, well, if we have computers to replace those of us that are validating, transcripts or diplomas or certificates, then we won't need people. And I think there are so many examples that you can look back and say that that's not the case. The majority of us in this country are or looking to have a partner vendor produce our transcripts. We're in that moment right now at the University of Washington. I'm certainly not going to have a less need for people to serve our students. We have more and more students. But why not have technology take care of folding purple pieces of paper so that we can be there to meet with students and advisors and others? So I don't think we have to be afraid that by having this it's going to replace people and jobs, but it may be that people that were doing one kind of work might be doing something else. This whole idea that I had come across and talked about at the Lumina convening of really this fear of access and equity, and I actually think this one is a valid fear. How do we get on board? How do we have the resources? How will we convince our institutions, especially smaller institutions, community colleges that are really facing declining budgets and in some cases declining enrollments, to jump on board this blockchain train? And again, if there's this idea that with records belonging to learners, that they would have some kind of key, and don't ask me what that means, but where they could actually give it to somebody to say, yes, you can use this to go validate my record. Well, if I've got that and I'm giving it to Amazon to check something out and another student doesn't have it and doesn't know how to do that, is there equity in the process there? Fear of scalability of this for all institutions. If you think about that higher education would be a private blockchain that we're all on it together, would everybody be able to jump in? Would we all be able to, if we're all using blockchain to be kind of each other's validators, could all 5,000 college universities, and even think of international, jump on board? And again, that fear of lacking information and technology resources to make that happen on campus, or more importantly, why would this even be a thing? I know as I've started to socialize this even in my own university IT, they're aware of it. They're like, yeah, that's down there, that's that Bitcoin thing. But when we're still trying to replace our legacy system from 1983, is this really going to be a priority? Something to think about there. But the other thing I really learned from this is, why do we trust humans over smart math with blockchain? I mean, humans can make mistakes. How many of us have been entering something for a student and you look away because someone asked you something and you've typed in the wrong number and suddenly you've put a grade on the wrong student record? Literally at the University of Washington, we must have 2 to 3 fraudulent diplomas presented to us every week. So we're having to go in and, how did they do this? Well, they just simply went to some graphic design tool. Well, if you're using computers that are going to either say, yes, this is the original document, this was produced by the college or university, and math is validating it either is or isn't, wouldn't that be something that we would want to trust? And getting back to, again, the computer doesn't care. No emotions. Either it validates the credential or not. So I thought a lot about how many times I had doubted Siri, besides the story where people run into walls because they trusted Siri. But how often did I question Siri's intelligence about the fastest way for me to get to SeaTac to the airport, and she was right. And I don't have to understand why she's right. I can be amazed by it, but I could trust that. So this acknowledgement of fear really caused me to be very defensive, if you will, for those of you perhaps in the line that are registrars. I was becoming, wanting to watch out for us and like, what is our role in this, and what if we can't ramp up, and how do we make sure that everyone is respectfully understanding and learning this? And again, that's what's brought me to the table to so many of these conversations I've been invited to, is I'm really there representing us that aren't the initial adopters of this technology, if you will. So I returned back to campus after my trip to Indiana with Lumina in last October, and really put my doctoral research skills to work. I watched more than 10 blockchain videos. I would just go to YouTube and what is blockchain, what is blockchain? And quite frankly, if it became too technical, like it was meant for programmers, I moved on. Teach me, just like I had done with that statistics class. I read everything I could find on blockchain. I taught my computer to watch for articles on blockchain. I talked about it to whoever would listen. I found out that one of my own team members was a part of the original Bitcoin industry, blah, 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 in Seattle, and I took him out to coffee, and I said, explain this to me in a way that I can understand. But what was happening is, you know what, I knew that I could do this. I could understand this. Hopefully, we'll find out today, I could explain it to other people. And I started to know, kind of, what I was talking about at last. It was a really good feeling. One of the best blockchain explanations I found that I simply love, and I decided not to mess with technology for this webinar, and so I've given you the link, and I really encourage you to go spend 22 valuable minutes and go watch Richie Etuaro's Blockchain Massively Simplified. The TED Talk has been watched so many times, it's a little aged, so just bear with that. But he goes through and explains it in a way that was so accessible, and where I was in my journey, I'm like, okay, yep, I know what that is. I get what that is. And you see the picture of the tangerines at marker 2028. Definitely pay attention to that. That just opened up my eyes beyond all belief, and I'll tell you about that in a second, why this whole blockchain thing would even matter outside of higher education. Like, wow, the implications for what we could do with that. So if you do nothing else, please go back and click on that link and take a look at that TED Talk. I think you'll be really happy to see that. So what did I get out of his TED Talk? So he talks about right away, so spoiler, I'm going to tell you things he talked about. You're watching this TED Talk on the internet and on YouTube. And when you think about it, those are all technologies that we didn't have how short of a time ago, and that now we just kind of take for granted. But a lot had to happen to make these things work for us. The internet didn't happen overnight. YouTube didn't happen overnight. So he's just talking about, and he does this whole kind of journey through technological advancement that's really interesting. And that we really take technology for granted. And he talks a lot about the trust gap, and there's an error on the slide, I apologize. He says that blockchain is about using technology not to expand, but to close that trust gap, to reinstill trust when we're certifying records, and I really resonated to that. So the tangerine explanation at the end really took me to a new level, as I said. And so here's what he said about tangerines. I'll just summarize it for you. He talked about that he's super allergic to some kind of something in non-organic tangerines. And he said, so if he gets there's a label that says it's organic, but you can go print those up, Kinko's anywhere. But what if he could use blockchain technology and some kind of key or tool that he would use that would scan the tangerine that was marked organic, and it would go back through using blockchain technology all the way back to when it first grew on a tree, it was harvested, it went to the tangerine plant, that he could verify that nowhere along the line did somebody switch out organic tangerines for non-organic. And by being able to trust that that had not happened, that's actually a life-saving moment for him, because then he's not going to accidentally get a fraudulent, if you will, tangerine or bad tangerine that had been tainted. So it was fabulous. And so really what he says is we don't have to understand this technology. We need to not fear it. I also went on to look at a whole bunch of articles, so I definitely suggest this one for you to go check out. Some highlights on that one. It just gave me more understanding about why this is applicable in higher education. Blockchain is a distributed database, so it could be over many campuses, and we could create our own blockchain to validate each other. This idea of a timestamp is super important. So every record has to have a time date stamp, and it's sequential. So if there's a time and date stamp on one block and the one above it is out of order, it's not going to work. So it's a way to make sure that it's continued through. We don't have to rely on third parties. Imagine if we didn't need banks. Heaven forbid if we didn't need transcript vendors, if people could just validate, and cutting out that middleman. And I found out what that word disintermediation means. My friend Mark explained it from Indiana. It's like Uber, that we used to call a taxi company to arrange a ride, and now we just contract with the Uber driver, so there's no middle person there anymore. And that's a lot of what blockchain is like. Finally, educational records do not actually live on the blockchain, but just validating that the information hasn't been tampered with. Don't really understand what I just said, but I'm choosing to trust it, but it's an important point. Okay, moving on to Texas. Went off to a really cool meeting. It was the second time I'd met. It was my first time attending at the University of Texas in Austin, and it was a gathering of AAU registrars talking about this future of the transcript. What might we do differently? Thinking again about that comprehensive learner record, and not necessarily just depending on Carnegie units and courses and degrees, but bringing in all the other things that a learner might do. So I was holding my own. I was following what they were talking about technologically, but as I looked around the room with professors and researchers and, again, technical people, I did have a little like, oh, what am I doing here? But I brought my chief academic officer, and that's a really important part as you think about bringing this back to your campuses, or if you're moving into a comprehensive learner record, you want to make sure that you've got a sponsor back on your campus. So by bringing our chief academic officer, and then when I return from this meeting, gathering some folks together, just planting that seed. What if we had a comprehensive learner record? What if we use blockchain as a way of validating? Could we imagine that happening here? Looking around the room, which again had different folks from UT Austin, but some of my colleagues, my friends of AA registrars, there were more women in the room. So I was like, okay, finally more people are coming to this conversation, my bride, my group. And I started, like I said, imagining bringing it back to UW. And my colleague, Sue Van Voorhees, who's at University of Minnesota, gave me a fabulous document that I want to share some items from it. And it was something I think that they had created for youth at University of Minnesota to try to explain some of the terms. So I'm going to do my best on the slide to just walk you through Helen's versions of what these things mean. And you can Google and watch videos to get them more technical if you'd like. So a hash, or hashes, you hear that all the time. It's a cryptographic hash function. It's a 30 alphanumeric randomly generated number that is in a block, and the block before it would pick up the hash from the block before it, and then when you add a new block, it would have that hash. So it's like an embedded code that shows that the block is in order and that nothing has been tampered with. I guess that's the best way I would explain it. A Merkle tree, and to be honest, I couldn't even remember last night when I was going back over my notes what it was. So I went out and I saw a great video on blockexplorer.com, because that's what I do and I don't remember, that explained it. And you don't have to really know what a Merkle tree is, but it's just a pattern of hash and hash functions that are going through and making sure that nothing has been tampered with along the way. Blocks are those record files that have the group of transactions. So they're stacking in these blocks. And the chain is just that series of blocks. And again, remember, it's date, time, stamp sensitive. So if something is out of order, it's going to show that perhaps it was tampered with or that there was a chain. So the chain is just a series of blocks of information using Merkle trees and these hash code to be able to open up and use blockchain to validate what's in that document. Her document or her article also talked about identity management in higher education. And what I liked about this is it just gave me a sense of who are the players in this moment in higher ed. So we are always and forever going to be the credential provider. We're the ones that are producing, whether it's just a transcript, a diploma, or in a comprehensive record validating another student's experience. Nothing's going to change. The credential verifier, and they use the word miner or machine validation, that's some kind of blockchain magic that goes through and is making sure that, again, things haven't been altered in the chain. And the owner of the credential, and I would offer you this, is the student and the learner. We still are the ones that are the custodians of the records, certainly, but they own their records, and that's a big transformation, I want to say. And then the party to whom the credential is released could be employers, institutions, anywhere the learner wants it to go. So imagine not needing to have, again, our transcript partners or the clearinghouse, heaven forbid, to do this. The student or the learner presents their key. The person receiving the transcript or the document wants to know it's valid. They put the key back in at the university or college. It says, yep, it's good, and they're good to go. Okay, 2 more stops along the way, and we're doing great on time, I think, here. So I went back to the meeting of the American Association of University Registrars in Florida in February, and we got to hear from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They are really leading the way in terms of being truly, I think, the first university or college, along with some work that Stanford's done, to use blockchain to validate their diplomas. And one of the things that Matt Gia told us back at that Lumina convening is you don't need to hire someone to do a blockchain. But I think it was smart that MIT partnered with a company called Learning Machine because they're one of the first ones out the gate to do this. So hearing about that, as I'm sitting there, I'm like a teenager in my understanding. I'm like, okay, I'm getting it. I know what they're talking about. And again, the excitement or the really coming up inside of me that I want to be part of that catalyst, be a registrar to get us to embrace and accept this and continuing to think about scalability and access. And I want to reach out. We just had a survey that came out from ACRO that you might have seen showing the profile of registrars in this country, and most of them are women in their 30s or 40s. And we can do this as much as men, but again, this has been primarily kind of a male-led conversation, but we want to scale this up so that we all, different institutions, different folks can have access to this. I can't do the exercise with you online that I'll do at the Tech Conference in Minnesota, but this really cool exercise they did just to very simply understand blockchain. I want to explain it to you. So when we came into the room, 8 folks were randomly given these cards that had the words, "We too understand, come, blockchain promise you can." And Mary, who was leading it from MIT, would point to people and just randomly have them read the sentence that you can see there in step 1. She would then say, okay, there's a number on your cards. Now who has number 1? Oh, that's me, you. Who's number 2? Ken. And once they read them in order, then the sentence made sense. And I love that exercise because what it's really saying is that the time and the order, think of that timestamp I talked about, is so key to understanding blockchain. So it's a really cool, simple way to explain it. So the final step, over the last first spring, I've been to DC, California, Maryland, involved in a really exciting group that's being funded by Lumina. It's a second grant through ACRO to increase the number of institutions who are creating these comprehensive learner records. And I'm in this data integration group where we're really talking about, okay, what information do we know is on our campuses? What's in Canvas? What's in OrgSync? What's in our student systems? What are all the different pieces of a student's experience and all these different databases that if we pulled it together into this one record, how could we imagine using blockchain to allow someone, like think of like an electronic resume, that if someone got a resume, which is really just the learner's story, they could click through and say, yep, they got their diploma, and they can click through and say, yes, they did this research experience, or yes, they were president of their organization. And that's what these groups have been talking about and working with employers. So I'm in this meeting with folks who are very technical experts who've been in this conversation a lot longer than I am. And I'm looking around, and there are only 2 women in the group of 10, again, but we've just added in a 3rd woman, yay. And I want to say that I understand these databases. I know what needs to be incorporated, and I really technically have no idea how it happens, but I'm really chill about that. I don't need to know. People that understand that can make it happen. What I do want to do is step out in faith that learners and employers will eventually come to realize that this disruptive innovation is something that we need, and they'll make it happen. We attended a workshop for registrars, and I attended a workshop with people that were like the CIOs and the CFOs of Google and Toyota and all these big companies. And it was really daunting to be in there. But in the afternoon, they actually put a microphone in my hands and said, we want to hear from the registrars. What do you think you can do to help us in these validations? So we are having a voice. So that was pretty exciting. So I want to show you what was really cool, and I'm wrapping up here so I can answer some questions, is I realized as I was putting this deck together that my journey over the last 2 years in itself is a blockchain. So if you think about, as I go through what I've shared with you, starting in Anaheim, and then back to Florida and Seattle, and then back to New Orleans and Indiana, and then I'm going to Texas and back to Florida, and then where I was this spring, this is in itself a blockchain. I couldn't have started out of order. I couldn't jump to what was going on at the meeting in February 2018 with AAU and then hop back to the Western Association and then jump back to Lumina. My very experience of learning blockchain depended on me going through these steps and through these blocks. So my learning and my cultural transformation from each experience informed the next block along the way, informed the next block along the way. So it's kind of cool to think about that even as I went through it, it's a blockchain in itself. I thought that was pretty cool. So here is my most important message for you of all. Ultimately, why does understanding blockchain as a registrar matter? That's what we're talking about today. Blockchain as a 3.0 web technology doesn't matter. And you might be like, wait, what? Helen, you just spent all this time talking about blockchain. It could matter. It could be the technology we use, but we don't know by the time we're ready to consume this that there won't be some other disruptive innovation that's going to come along, a technology that's even better. So do take the time to understand blockchain because it's what we're talking about now, but remain open that there could be other technologies that work even better. Secondly, it's really important that we allow learners and job seekers to be able to represent their full experiences beyond just grades and class titles, so that they can get the jobs that match up with employers and graduate schools and the places they want to go. And think about our role as registrars, that we are the catalyst for this disruptive innovation to take off. We can be the one. I keep saying as I travel to all these meetings, who's going to go first? Is it going to be the human resources systems? There are like 5 out there, all these companies that are going to start consuming something well beyond just diploma and grades, and I've got a degree? Is it going to be the registrars at the college and universities? Is it going to be the students demanding that? But we can be a part of that. And then I really have confidence that jobs are not going to be taken away by blockchain. We, right now, again, we use transcript vendors and other people to do things. There'll still be plenty of work to do, so we can't be afraid of that. Reading through my notes over the last 2 years to prepare this, I felt, again, my heart quickening and my voice, getting high and racing, because this is such an important moment for us. And it just thrills me that you were willing to spend time with me and joining me on my journey. And I encourage you in closing to really overcome your fear of the technological unknown. Embrace this cultural shift and let those that understand technology make it happen. And think about it. You've done it before. So with that, I really want to thank you for whether you joined us live or you're listening to this as a recording. Please do check out and sign up and come to the ACRO Technology and Transfer Conference. There'll be a lot more fabulous sessions around blockchain and the comprehensive learner record. I'd love to meet you and to have a chance to have you learn more firsthand what's going on. And I think we've got some time. Maybe I could turn over for some questions, Cass?
What was that? We have some
I
questions.
think I could do some questions, yeah.
Yes, we do have some time.
So I'm going to go through and see, thank you for those who weighed in, and I'll do my best to respond. So Dina, hello, says, would you please share that enlightenment with us? What is blockchain? It seems like you're doing what happened to you where speakers talked over your head. Well, my goodness, I apologize for that. So again, over the 2 years, what I hope that since you posted that, you have an understanding of blockchain. But blockchain is simply smart math, being able to go in and validate using a code that intelligence that's in a set of information has not been tampered with. And we know that because it's distributed over a whole bunch of other people that have access to that same information. So that if you have a transcript and someone changed a grade, and that's been kept as a date stamp and in this orderly blockchain, and someone changed it, and someone went to validate that, it would reject it because it had been amended. So that is my best hope in explaining blockchain. And if I've let you down on that one, I apologize. But it's just smart math, being able to validate that the codes that we expect to be there to say that nothing's been tampered with hasn't been tampered with, so that they can trust the document or the credential. So Michael said, would you please explain the benefit of blockchain in your examples as opposed to a simple cryptographic hash function? As best as I can understand it, why I'm so interested in blockchain, getting back to this comprehensive learner record, as a registrar, we spend a lot of time sending information to the National Student Clearinghouse so people can validate degrees and diplomas. We're producing documents, and what I think about is if someone could, as a student, as a learner, provide the key back to their document that we own, and that recipient of that credential could use this blockchain technology to validate it, it really takes out all the work that we're trying to do in this space. It takes out human error, and it makes it so that it can be validated. So again, with that electronic resume, instead of just what the applicant's presenting, instead of spending time when they're ready to offer the job that you're calling or trying to get the institution, getting a diploma and verifying it, that employer could use blockchain technology just to click through and say, yep, they got their degree at University of Washington this year, here's their GPA. Yep, they worked at this particular business and they learned this skill. So to me, we're not there yet, but what if we could use this technology to cut out the middle person and allow systems to say whether a document had been compromised or not. Again, think back to that tangerine example, maybe that helps. How do you deal with the loss of revenue if you're not charging for transcripts? Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. And I want to compliment you on that because even as recently last week in our meeting in Baltimore, I brought up that point. And I said many of us are still charging for transcripts and depend on that revenue. And the response I got back from the credential experts in the room is, well, who's to say that we don't turn our revenue stream to when organizations are using blockchain to validate? So just like Bitcoin is on a blockchain, and don't even have me explain that because I understand, but what if instead of purchasing or selling a transcript, when the employer or another institution needed to go in and validate it, there was some kind of charge there and it could be recorded. So that's what we're kind of looking at. But I have asked ACRO to be very sensitive to the fact that many of us depend heavily on that revenue. So thank you. Can I keep going, Kes?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Do you know of any vendor that's using blockchain technology to send academic transcript records currently? You know what? I don't. The only one I know about, as I alluded to, was MIT, but I think they're doing it for their electronic diplomas. So I know that Stanford, who really led the way with the work that Tom Black and his team did, were using blockchain to validate certificates that have been offered within their organization. But I'll talk to some folks at Acrotech and see if I can find out if anyone's yet doing this with transcripts, but it's a good question. Someone answered that MIT is using Learning Machine as a pilot. Yeah, exactly. And Learning Machine actually approached us and wanted us to be a pilot at UW, and I said, we're just not systemically ready. We're not culturally ready for this, but it's good to know that there are companies, if you want, that can take care of the facilitation of that to help make that happen and educate in Saudi Arabia. And then what about changes to transcript, grades, changes, rescinded degrees? Thank you, Laura. That's exactly where I see the power of this as a registrar. So I dealt with a student my first week here who had gone through and perfectly replicated our transcript because she was trying to get into or stay in a sorority housing and had changed all of her grades. And it took us having to go back into our system and to reach out to faculty and did you change this, did you not, and then this whole big deal. If we were using blockchain, if that original transcript was sitting there on the block and it had data and someone had changed it and added that to the block, it wouldn't allow it because it wouldn't validate back down. If we're a part of that blockchain, meaning that we're changing grades, of course, there is a way to change records for us to do it. But if someone else were trying to come in and infiltrate the records and fraudulently do that, the blockchain will reject it. But we absolutely can continue. We own the credential. We custodians for the credential, and we can control what's on there. Whew. So I think that gets to the end of the questions. My email address is helenbg, like Helen Boy Girl, at uw.edu. I hope that I have given you some insight into understanding this. And again, my biggest message is I don't necessarily have to perfectly understand the science. I just have to be willing to open to that transformational moment that could happen, that we could think about validating credentials in a whole new way, and how I want we registrars to be at the front of this conversation as opposed to it happening to us. So thank you, my colleagues at ACRO, for allowing me to be here, and I hope to see you all at the Tech and Transfer Conference in Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Helen, and just a reminder that our next webinar is coming up on June 19th, and it's about our STEM endorsement program. So thanks again for attending, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.